So we're here today really to get some information and make sure that we understand the RFI and the key points and Q&A for that. I indicated that Michelle Walker is stranded in Minneapolis. It's my understanding she has made it back on the airplane, but she's not going to make it here. So we'll go ahead and begin with Michelle.
I just handed everyone hard copies of the RFI that really is substantively the same as the last time that we met, with just the modifications that we had discussed. But as we were trying to think about what we would do at this particular subcommittee meeting, we thought maybe walking through it or taking additional questions on this would be helpful. Do you want me to walk through it, or do you want to just ask questions about the document itself?
Well, Brad, I think you indicated you might want to know more about what was included in here.
I just, my thing was, and I'll just share with you, I had to skim this because I've been trying to read a bunch of other stuff related to the needs, but my key thing that I wanted to ask about, and I think it's more around the RFP, was that certain things that we may need to make sure certain are part of the test design, that they're included in there. Because my understanding is a request for information is kind of more generalized. This is the direction we're heading in. Please come tell us how you might be able to match up to that. And then that we can actually still adjust our RFPs. Is that kind of the right process?
Right, so I think that a couple of pieces of the RFI might be helpful. So we have one section that specifically addresses measuring growth, and we literally printed from the online version. So there aren't page numbers, but if you look at page 8, if you start counting on the first substantive page, you'll see a section on measuring growth. And our consultant, Derek Briggs, drafted this language, and the idea is this way: anyone who responds to the RFI can speak to the ability for them to validly provide a growth calculation that can then feed into both accountability and, of course, feed into teacher evaluation. We would, as you said, the RFI is just the RFI, but we would want to include similar types of language for the RFP. And then the other language that I think that you're speaking to is there's, as Molly mentioned in the business meeting, we spent about 4 hours on Friday trying to map out the new accountability system, new assessments, and new standards all at once, all the way through 16-17. And one piece of that is something that I think you've been asking about, which is we are at this point planning to do standard setting in summer of 15 based on assessments administered in 14-15, which would not be the same as it's using the Indiana College and Career Readiness Transition Assessment alongside I-STEP items. And so we put language in here, and I think this was your request, to ask vendors to address how they would be able to utilize the information provided through that standard setting process. But that is to some degree a challenge. And I think we are also talking with, I shouldn't say I think, I know that Molly and Deb were planning to talk with Damien about the ability to utilize a smaller number of items from the Indiana College or Career Readiness Transition Assessment to feed into a potential growth calculation for 15-16. Because a big piece of this is the question of, does this mean that there will be a year or years where we don't have growth because of the change in assessments? And those are some of the sorts of things that when we mapped out all of these systems changing at once, that's obviously one of the big questions in front of us is will that happen? And if that does happen, what does that do to our accountability system?
The other area I was talking to Superintendent Ritz about, and it's just because my school law is a little rusty in this area, with regard to student population groups such as special needs, English language learners, what assessment responsibilities do we have statutorily, like where it may require some kind of a modified assessment or a changed assessment, and how is that reflected in the RFI?
So we do specifically address the IMAST is going away. So we will no longer have a modified assessment, and we have requested that vendors responding to the RFI, and again, I think we'll see this, we'll put similar language into the RFP, address how their assessment platform would be able to absorb those students who previously were assessed on the IMAST. I think the number that I recall is about 30,000 students who have been taking IMAST. So we'll want to make sure that that the new assessment can absorb those students and be able to provide them with an appropriate level assessment.
Are you talking about even more than just those students? Because we have lots of, other students who have special needs who don't take even the IMAS, still have the test read to them, and so there would need to be all of those accommodations also.
So, correct. IEPs can have various sorts of accommodations. You can have read aloud, you can require
But all
additional
those
time, you
students
can.
are special ed.
Right.
So,
They wouldn't be all IMAS.
yeah, so, and those are different. Those are more accommodations rather than a
Okay.
modified or an
Okay.
alternative assessment.
Gotcha.
And they will, the presenters would address, let me back up. So some assessments, for example, I read 3. It does, that assessment in particular, the position has been that a read aloud accommodation is not permissible on the assessment itself, because it is, as they say, a reading comprehension assessment. And therefore, that accommodation has been determined to be inappropriate for the particular platform. So that is a decision that gets made both from the vendor end as well as on a policy end, whether there are going to be prohibited accommodations. Typically, most accommodations that are written into an IEP will be honored. So a really common one is that if individuals need to take it print or paper copy rather than an electronic version of the assessment, those will be honored.
Large print also.
Yes, large print. I always say, JAWS,
Braille.
Braille, all of the typical accommodations. But I do think things like read aloud and whether they think that would be a permissible accommodation is something we could ask specifically about.
Something that I was looking for under that baseline requirements for elementary and secondary assessments, I didn't see it in there, but I did go through it very quickly. Anything with regard to looking at scope in terms of what Indiana's doing now. When we started this conversation, we had a nice handout from Michelle that said, here are all these different assessments we're doing. One of the things we've talked about is there a way to integrate assessments into a single assessment? So, and it may be in there just.
Right, so on the RFP, there is a link where it specifically mentions the table of assessments, and this
Okay.
is contained with the RFI, and
Yeah.
there
Gotcha.
is both
Everything
the
in this
currently.
little packet is accessible to them.
So they can see both the Indiana current required assessments and whether it's required under NCLB or ESEA, or whether it's required under state law. And then we also provide the various other assessments that may not be specifically required, but that are offered at the state level. And that way, as we described last time, we drafted the RFI really broadly so that vendors could respond to all or part and tell us what that they think they could do and which portions of both our required and optional assessments they think they could create a product that would fulfill.
And again, got to ask another one.
Mhm.
It's not time to read it in depth. One of the other concerns I've had is with regard to the secondary level assessments. Any language in here about their ability to show statistical evidence of congruence with other exams such as SAT, ACT, so that we have some idea that our state standards we just adopted are preparing students, or is that an expectation? Like, would the vendor have to be able to demonstrate they can provide some kind of correlation analysis as we get going along to show us how we're doing benchmarked against other national exams?
So there is not language specifically to that in the RFI. In the RFP, the language that we have in the RFI, and I assume will be in the RFP, would require alignment to the Indiana academic standards, but we don't have language in to do a correlation study to things like SAT, ACT. If that's something that the board would want, then that could be put in, or the other option is that That can be done by folks other than the vendor as well. My recollection is a couple of years ago, I'm gonna look at Dan Clark here, but we did an alignment study looking at, I think, the PSAT or ACT to Indiana academic standards. So you can do alignment studies to standards, or we can do correlation studies to those assessments, and I guess it becomes a policy question of whether you want to put the onus of that responsibility on the vendors, or if you want to hire a third party to look at that.
I know it doesn't have to be an RFI, I would just encourage my colleagues here that we think about that for the RFP, particularly now that Indiana's being kind of focused on us having backed away from Common Core. I think it's gonna be important that we can actually put solid data that's valid and reliable. And I personally would rather put that on the vendor when we get that out to say, we expect that you're able to do that kind of statistical analysis and give us a review of how we're doing comparatively nationally, if not internationally as well. But
And something we've been trying to have conversations again with, and we have Dan here as the executive director for the roundtable, about various options that align with what we're hearing from the accountability panel. But while we are hearing that we want to have a vertically scaled assessment to allow us to have a clear growth calculation for the high school model, perhaps one of the options would be to go, say we do something similar to what we have now, where now we have 3 through 8, extend that 3 through 10, but in 11th grade, rather than extending all the way through 11th grade, offer a suite of options for students to take that would be college and career determiners. So there you could see the ACT, SAT for individuals who are wanting to go to traditional colleges, and then having more workplace readiness assessments for students who are considering entering the workforce. That would be an option, something like that, and then you wouldn't be into the correlation question of whether our new statewide assessment is correlated to performance on the SAT or ACT, but rather they're just going to the students would choose to take one of those. Please.
One of the things that might lend support for Michelle's analysis is the definition of college and career readiness given to the panel, given to the college and career readiness standards panel, which referenced.
Do you want to come sit by me?
I think that definition of college and career readiness referenced baccalaureate degrees, associate degrees, industry certifications, and military service.
Right.
And so with that definition, it might lend
some language.
support for that Michelle's
Yep.
analysis that maybe multiple options, the 11th grade.
The challenge of trying to find one assessment that can assess all of those areas at once would be probably challenging. Granted, we will hear in response to the RFI, perhaps vendors can do that, but it's just been a conversation around how do we fulfill that definition of college and career readiness, align with what we're hearing from the accountability panel, and give students, as you described, meaningful data about whether they really are college and career ready.
Okay.
Any other questions from Michelle? So the relationship between content and item type, if you don't mind, we'll probably delay that and have that conversation at our next meeting. And I'm going to suggest that we have a meeting prior to June 12th, which is when we're going to have the RFI process with the vendors take place. I think that date's already been established. And we have a meeting in June, a board meeting. So perhaps right after that, we can, because those types of questions, if we have those kinds of things, we'll want to have those solidified, so we ask them of each one, and kind of know what it is what that process is going to be about. With that, at the last time, I suggested that we have liaisons from 3 other entities to help us inform our work, at my request, really. And it was a couple people from the accountability panel, a couple people from higher education, and a couple people from the round table. And so I sought to begin that process. I think I used the wrong term when I actually sent an email out and used the word appointment, because this committee actually doesn't really have what I would call you're an informative body to the Department of Education as we go through our whole process of actually determining a vendor, and I welcome that. But I would like to expand it so we have some liaisons. They don't have to be members of this committee, but I'd like to have them present. I'd like them to hear about the process. I'd like them to be informative, so that each one of those groups, which are going to be intertwined in some way with assessment, to really help inform what it is that we might do and offer us input with that.
Can I make a quick comment
You
on that?
may.
Could we, if it would be appropriate, whether we do it here or I can talk to you about this privately even, but I'd like to know who, what organizations and where, because one in particular that I think I'm aware of that may be involved has been somewhat critical of the board, and I just want to make sure that people who are coming are not bringing and introducing a political element into a really critical conversation. I want to keep it about students, and so I may even want to talk to you about that offline, but I am concerned about how, if we're going to have folks here, particularly people representing the field of education, that if it's a teacher, that it's somebody that's coming from the profession with that in mind.
Not sure what you would be speaking to. So the people that I had identified, and I did go to Steve Yeager, the accountability co-chair, and so we identified Robert Lugo and Jessica Fieser. Robert Lugo is a intermediate 5-6 school in Warren Township principal, and has had absolutely wonderful comments on the accountability panel. And then Jessica Fieser is an ESL teacher, currently employed in IPS. She just got one of those new positions that you heard Dr. Farabee speaking about. And then the commissioner, Teresa Lubbers, appointed or didn't appoint, but I guess suggested, Dr. Stacy Townsley and Sam Sneidman. They also participated in the standards review. And then looking at the roundtable, I am suggesting Teresa Meredith, representing ISTA, so that we have a teacher's perspective. And then Claire asked if I had any suggestions for someone else on the roundtable, and I suggested Stacy Hughes, who is a teacher.
So just so that the superintendent's aware, there was a release last night from ISTA talking about the political theater of the board, and it just kind of gives me a little pause of concern when I see that kind of thing. So I'm not saying ISTA shouldn't be involved, but I just want to make sure that it's understood that if you're going to be advising, I would rather see those kind of things not being publicized.
Oh.
I don't think it's appropriate, and then turn around and be in a role where you're advising the board at the same time you're out smacking them publicly. So that's my own personal, I'm not speaking for the board, I'm speaking as one board member. I would have a real concern about that, because we have to be able to trust each other, we have to be able to engage in deep level conversations. This is serious work we're doing, and I just want to make sure I didn't feel like, I personally was offended by that comment yesterday, because I didn't feel like yesterday was about political theater. I thought it was about a very serious matter that impacts about 2 million students in the state. So I just need to express that to you, that I have a real concern when I see that. And I know Teresa, I've counted her a friend of mine, but I get disappointed when I see that kind of stuff go out from any kind of organization, not just ISTA, but I happened to see that one last night.
Carrie?
The governor has done a good job of appointing lots of educators, and even fortunately here, even on our subcommittee, we've got elementary and middle school and
Sure.
and high school and college, and so
That's why I appointed you.
right. And so, I feel like we represent the educational field, and I'm an ISTA member, and so I feel
Sarah's
like
too.
I'm AFT.
that I represent that niche also. The meetings are certainly open to the public. When I even asked about attending the A to F meetings and stuff, to give advice to them or to even hear what was happening in the A to F, the response was that the meetings are public, and, so, they're welcome to attend, and I'm happy to go to lunch with them and hear anybody's opinion, whether they are watching online or not, but I want to just point out, we are fortunate we have educators here, and we represent different niches, and I feel like that's a good thing.
And I do consider my role to be representing teachers as well.
Well, I guess I wish we would have had this conversation last time when I kind of brought it up, because I left thinking that it was okay that I went ahead and started this process. So, because there wasn't any conversation regarding yay or nay, or yeah, so I left thinking that was okay to do.
I think we were
So-
talking a concept the last time, and now you're talking about specific organizations, and I'm just reacting to a post that I saw go out through one organization last night, and I'm just saying, I think it's a reasonable request if we're going to be drawing upon people to advise.
Well, we don't have any time to waste, so I can gather information and input from these people or these groups in my own way. It's my way of seeking further liaison work, because we're going to need to actually work with all three of these groups. So it was my way of doing that.
I
So
would
I can,
support having them here.
huh?
I would
I would support having them here.
I support having them here. I just would like it to be made clear, and I can address that on my own.
I would rather have them here.
I would too. I'm not saying don't, I'm just expressing a concern.
And I do want to clarify, Superintendent Ritz, I'm sorry for not responding until this morning to your email, but the roundtable's meeting on the 11th, and I think it was supposed to be on the agenda to talk about their involvement in the assessment subcommittee, and so you had asked for a recommendation from the governor, and I think that because an entity has to act by majority vote, that it should really come from the roundtable selecting its representatives from the roundtable. So I think it's appropriate to have them involved, but they're not going to be voting members like we talked about, because this isn't a subcommittee of the State Board of Education.
But we're also meeting on the 12th. So, I mean, we're meeting on the 12th with the RFI process. So, I mean, they would have to, whoever it might be, would have to be available like the next day, all day. And I don't want to delay what we're doing. So, I mean, because from my point of view, at the department's role, you know, we've delayed even the starting of the College and Career Ready assessment piece, because there were questions about what that looked like, and so we didn't even get started on that when we needed to. And so we have a lot of work to do. I'm not wanting to delay this in any way, what we're going to do here. So if we're going to invite people to come, I would feel bad that representatives from, is there something specific that the governor and I as co-chairs can't have two people come as liaisons?
Well, and I was going to suggest that Dan Clark, as the executive director of the roundtable, he could send a letter to the roundtable saying, because of our timeline, and, you know, kind of poll members or something like that. Dan, I don't know, you've been working for the roundtable for quite some time. So if you have a thought.
That can be expedited. I can find out who's interested relatively easily.
So then how do they get here? I mean, the governor and I don't say, hey, we'd like you to join us. It's just whoever wants to say, yeah, I'll be here.
They could be here in two capacities. If they were interested, they could be here to observe. And on the 11th, one of them will be designated.
So if we have several people to apply, who decides? I mean, if several people want to do it, like, who decides then? I guess my assumption was that as co-chairs, this wasn't a big deal. So, I mean, I don't know how that works.
Could it not go to the roundtable as a request from the board for a specific person, and see if there's
Sure,
agreement?
that's kind of what I was suggesting, is that Dan would work
Yeah,
directly
so
with
we
the
could
members,
make it as a recommendation that this is the individual you're seeking.
because we're on a tight time frame. We're not
Yeah.
going to change the meeting date. We
However,
have to move
Now,
I
that,
haven't-
that
I-
would be open door. I think that might be more of an issue, to be honest.
I just have a question. You have contacted these people?
I've had conversation with him, yeah, 'cause
Conversation.
I thought the last time I left that, I mean, they say, yeah, I'll be glad to do it. So, yeah, I thought that's what I was supposed to do as of the end of the last meeting. I didn't think there was any objection to having them serve, you know, in a liaison capacity. I even mentioned the 3 groups. So, I know Sam from CHE contacted me personally and said, you know, we heard that you might be appointing somebody, or, you know, in that kind of capacity. And I said, yeah, I asked Teresa for me who she'd like to send. So I didn't feel like I left with any, what I would call pushback to going ahead with this and having liaisons, you know, come from each of those 3 entities. So.
And I'm happy to have them here. I just also want to, want to make clear, you know, at the same time, they're not voting, we're happy to have them, we're happy to get input from lots of people.
Well, even this
But-
group doesn't vote.
But,
Yeah,
right,
this group doesn't
but also
vote.
even just, you know, I mean, we do represent all of those groups too.
I say we move forward. I don't think it's that big a deal. I think we did talk about it conceptually, but things do transpire from the time we have a meeting, and I was just expressing one concern, and I can express it in other venues, so I think it's fine. I think the clarity I wanted to have this morning, we talked about, was I just want to make sure that they understand their ex officio. We, like you said, Troy, none of us are really voting, we're making a recommendation back, but there is a difference with the group that's here right now of the board, because we were sanctioned by the full board as an actual approved assessment subcommittee, so through resolution. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page that way.
So I'll just kind of clarify where I was. I mean, certainly I'm on both entities, you know, the roundtable and the accountability panel. But I don't think that me should be the only person from that accountability panel when we get ready to talk about assessments. You know, that it should come from a couple people that really are serving on the panel, not just me as the co-chair that's serving on several committees. The same as Dan. You know, Dan's the director of the roundtable, but I don't think he's not necessarily a member of making that happen. So my purpose was just making sure that we had broad constituency. I like to work wherever things are going to have impact. That's important to me. I can do it in a lot of ways. I thought this would be the easiest way and the quickest way to make that happen. So we need to decide what we're doing with the roundtable, I suppose. I don't want to violate open door by having them vote on somebody. I don't want to do that.
May I suggest that Dan works offline with you and with me, and we can figure out how to make it happen without violating the open door law and in alignment with our time frame, so we don't leave them out because they should be part of the conversation.
Okay,
Is that okay?
we'll do that.
Great.
And so what else I'm suggesting is that these people attend, these liaisons attend our next board meeting
Fourth.
day, when we'll have our next meeting. Is it June?
I think it's the 4th.
June 4th, so that we can kind of get them up to speed, talk about what the RFI process is going to be when the vendors are really here, and then move forward with that with actual conversation.
If I may, just
Sure,
for
Sarah.
clarification, I'm wondering if, because I do wholeheartedly want input from all stakeholders and from all groups involved. I guess for me, it just feels like it's no longer a subcommittee, but instead more of a review panel type situation anyway. And I don't know logistically how that changes things, but that just feels more.
And I'm not trying to say we don't want constituent input,
Right.
we don't want to listen to people, but that's, I guess, how I'm kind of feeling the same.
To me, if it's sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, this is an official committee of the board, so it does, it can vote.
So if we're inviting other people in, it doesn't feel like it's a committee anymore. So I guess I'm just asking for clarification on the design of what we're doing.
I really think the more input we have, the better this group can make a decision to help support the department in this process. And I think that's what our role is to be a supporting role for the department and to be able to reflect that to the rest of the board, that we do support the direction and the efforts of this committee.
Well,
And I can do that without them ever, I can invite them anyhow. I can invite them, they can sit out there, and then I can go have a meeting with them.
Well, I don't think that's what we want to do.
No.
But I can do that.
I would hope that would be.
That's like
That's
not a
not-
problem.
But that, I don't think that's reflecting the will of what you're hearing from your assessment subcommittee, and I would hope you wouldn't do that, so.
So what am I hearing?
I guess I'm just asking for clarification too. Are we anticipating that they will be asking questions during the RFI, RFP process as well? Will they have interactions with the vendors that come in?
That was my intent, but we don't have to do that.
Because
I can
I
just
just
have
worry
them-
about that blurring a line also with, if they're allowed to, why couldn't anyone come in and part of it is that I don't understand the format of the meeting structure as well when we're to that point. But I just worry about it blurring a line also on, I fully want them to be here. I don't want to be misread that I think more
I think-
information is
Well,
better. I just want to make sure we're
being here
concise
and being a participant, I thought was the same thing. So if you're not wanting them to be a participant, then I will simply invite them to be here, and then I'll gather their input later. That's not an issue with me.
Okay, because I think, it just seems to me what seems appropriate when you have an assessment subcommittee of the board is that the deliberations that occur around the RFI and the RFP would be limited to the members of the subcommittee who would be making a recommendation back to the full board. So if you go outside of the subcommittee, while their input is helpful and welcomed, it's in the context of, we're seeking information, and from your perspective as a representative of your organization, what's your opinion? But when it comes to a vendor coming in and us asking questions, if there's 5 board members on the subcommittee are competing with them for the same amount of time to ask questions, I would have a problem with that. Deliberation's different in my mind than asking for outside input, stakeholder input. So I do want stakeholder input. I just want clarity that the assessment subcommittee has the responsibility for deliberating and vetting vendors and making recommendations. I think that's what the resolution said was adopted. So I think it's, so I apologize if we talked about last month and you had a different interpretation. My interpretation was you wanted to get outside stakeholder input, and I'm going, that makes sense. I would want Teresa Lover's advice. I even want to hear, frankly, what Teresa Meredith has to say. But when it comes to deliberation, that's where a line gets, a demarcation line there is there for me, and assessment subcommittee takes over at that point and works through that to make a recommendation to the full board.
Well, I guess really this is my decision as to whether I want to include them or not. So I'll have to think about what I want to do. So our next meeting will be on the 4th. And I'll have some further conversation with members of my department, and we'll just talk about how we want to gather input from stakeholders and how we want that to look.
Can I ask a related question to
Sure.
that? What would, I guess where I'm struggling, because I can sense concern on your part, but why would you think we would not want to hear from the stakeholders on their input? Because I guess my thing is I would want to hear that as well. So I don't want you to leave here thinking I don't want to hear what
So
the
from
folks.
from their point of view,
Okay.
they can come and sit in the audience and hear what we're talking about, and they can come and listen to the RFI. My purpose was to give them some participation in what we're going to be doing, because I can invite them and they can sit in the audience.
Yeah, and I don't think that's what we're saying. I guess that's where the disconnect is. I'm thinking that if you would invite them, we would actually engage them in dialogue about this is what we're thinking, this is what we've got for an RFI, and we'd actually have a two-way conversation with them. But that would be different from a meeting, for example, where vendors are coming through the front door and we're now listening and receiving presentations and asking questions. So I'm trying to reconcile the disconnect there, because I would want to hear from them and I'd want to dialogue with them. I value their input. I'm just saying where that starts and ends, I think maybe we're on a different page maybe.
Well, there's two purposes. One's to have them fully informed so that when they go back to their own constituencies, they can report out and they have information, rather than just me. Okay, so there's one purpose. The second purpose is for them to actually have a participation role in dialogue about what we're going to do.
And I'm good with that. I haven't said anything yet that I think anybody here would be objecting to.
I'm going to go back and think about it, and talk with my team about how we might make this look if they weren't actively here participating. Yes. Sure.
So I think an example that really struck us both, if these people are, I can see pros and cons to both. But let's say Ivy Tech, for example. They've been heavily involved in 1005 and helping us understand the placement of vacuum placer in our high schools. So part of this RFP is ultimately going to look at all levels of assessment. So if there's an Ivy Tech representative, invited through the roundtable or somebody who represents that realm of higher ed, and their role is just to listen. It's not ask a question. I don't know if any of us have that expertise the way they would have that expertise. So we would be lacking that lens of what is this likely to your institution? What does a gateway exam look like in career pathways, for example? So I just think by not letting them ask some questions, we may not get some answers for which we later will wish we knew in the RFP process.
Well, we have in the resolution that committee may, may solicit expert advice. And part of my impetus was these people have specific information that's relevant to what we're going to be doing. And not only that, assessment impacts what it is that they do, and how we have our kids college and career ready. So
Let me ask a question to your point. I mean, I appreciate your comment, Danielle, and I kind of see where you're coming from, but here's the concern I would have with that. I think there has to be a way to allow that exchange, but how do you then say, I mean, I haven't listed out, but I bet there's 35 professional organizations in the state of Indiana we could come up with. How do you tell 2 or 3, you get to come and be a part of that, but the others don't? How do I tell the Private Schools Association, you don't get a seat at the table, but ISTA does? So how do I answer that? See, that's the dilemma we get into, and I think it's perfectly fine, and the resolution says this, that we can seek out their input, and I agree with what you're saying. I guess the thing that I would ask is that we have people here already on the panel that have professional background. We have department staff that have some of this in their background, folks like yourself, Michelle Walker, and others. And I think at the end of the day, you do the best you can, and then if we want to bring them back and say, okay, you've heard the presentations and we want to have a second dialogue, you can. But I think we need to be very careful about commingling a function of an assessment subcommittee with opening that up to other people who have an active role in the dialogue that's going to result in a recommendation, because I think you're going to find you're going to alienate organizations.
So then you are supporting that we not have them as part of
I'm saying, I
process.
think the resolution frames an appropriate role for them to play, that they are an advisory and they're having input, and there's opportunities to have two-way dialogue. But I think when we come to a function of the board is now vetting a vendor, it comes back to the members of the board who were charged by the full board, which are the 5 board members sitting here, to work through that and ask those questions. That's our responsibility.
And I think it would be helpful to meet with them prior to that vetting process too, and what do we need to be looking through? What comes to your mind as you're looking through future assessments, and that those are great conversations to have and would be highly
Absolutely.
informative. But I agree that we cross a line and get into potential conflicts once we're actually conversing with the vendors that come in.
Well, I'll have conversation, like I said, with my department and with Dan, and we'll see how we might want to proceed. I can't help but think that this conversation might be different if there wasn't one person that was recommended.
No, I don't think so. I
So,
think the concern
that's how
would
I feel.
still be there. So, well, I mean, I can't help that. But I still think I still think from an objective standpoint, we're representing the entire board technically as a subcommittee, and we're making decisions away from the full board with their full support and knowledge. So we didn't run this by them this morning, and I don't think we needed to per se, but if the intent was is these organizations are actually going to have some influence into the final decision, that is a different, I think that does cross into a different reality that would probably deserve a full board conversation.
I did not envision that at all.
Okay.
Superintendent, who shows those 2 bodies, CHE, I think we all understand CHE.
Sure.
College Readiness, and the roundtable, because as you know, once we take this to them, it goes to them first. So them having a really in-depth knowledge of the process, they have to approve and recommend to you the assessment. Correct?
Correct.
Statutorily. So by having them come at this at the very end, flip that on yourselves. Would you want to be, so that's why those 2, so I guess I'm saying to Brad's point, I get there's lots of people invited, but they were chosen because of their role in college and career readiness and the
And I can put myself, because I asked the same thing for the A to F panel. I mean, I asked and said, can I sit in? And because I don't want to find out a week before we have to vote on it, and can I come? I'd like to learn. I need to sit and learn as much as I can learn. And I'm not being petty and saying that, so that was my answer, this is my answer, but the answer was, I could sit in the audience, or I could watch it live streamed. And so, I'm not saying that that's my answer because of it, but if it's going to the roundtable, they will have their opportunity to read it and answer it and have their say.
And maybe there's a reason, and we have a full board meeting on June the 4th, is that right?
Yes.
So maybe there's an opportunity there to, you know, if you're gonna go back and talk about it as a department, and maybe there could be some conversation with board staff on this, maybe you bring back an amendment to the full board on the resolution clarifying which groups you absolutely have to have in that conversation, and if hire a commission and roundtable or.
And that just
clarifying.
further delays what we're gonna do.
I don't
Those
know how.
people would need to be available on the 4th at our assessment committee, they would be, it's just,
But they would need to be here.
we just don't
anyways,
have
right?
time to waste, like, not 1 minute.
It might be an important distinction that there are groups statutorily charged to help make this decision, and that's the state board and the roundtable. And I think the roundtable is particularly sensitive in its responsibility to make a recommendation to the board that the board cannot change. And so the roundtable is interested in understanding as much as it can from the start. Because it has a statutory role, it might be distinguished from any other groups.
Correct.
Like the private schools or the universities, and we may have to find different venues or vehicles for them to have input. The other thing I would further suggest is the roundtable by law is half business community, half education. And the names suggested are both from one side of that equation. We can maybe rethink that and get one from either side of the equation, establish a liaison, and let the roundtable then talk about it on the 11th. We might accomplish multiple objectives here without doing any damage.
Sarah?
I think that's a valid point, and I think that it's easier for me to wrap my head around the addition of roundtable. I agree, both groups should be included, but that at least gives us some rationale also for their involvement.
Correct.
In that stage of it. So I think that I would be able to support roundtable representatives, but I think anything past that blurs the line for me.
I do believe, though, the A to F panel has a lot of vested interest in this process as they try to move forward in their timeline as was presented today at our meeting. And I think they need to be involved in our process here today in this conversation so that they can take that back to their committee in their timeline as it's spiraling at the same time. So, you know, I really support having them part just because of that, because we know the work that they have yet to do is very massive and intensive.
But I think the one thing too that sort of is, if I'm not mistaken, I believe the superintendent and Claire are both members of that ADF panel, so they already do have an inroad to this group. Is that not right? I mean, they are members of the ADF panel,
That's correct.
right? So we have two here already, so they're linked in that way. I mean, it could be other representatives, but.
I think we're still at the same spot. I need to talk with my team, and I'll have further conversations regarding how I want to proceed, I guess. So on the 4th's agenda, just to make sure that we have everything that we need before the RFI process, we are going to talk about the content and type items because you wanted further information about that. We're going to inform our RFI questioning and what kinds of information we would like to see as a board, make sure that they answer and kind of be in uniform with that. So we will spend some time doing that. And then on the 12th, we'll have the RFI process.
Now, will that be more than one day after the 12th? Are you sensing one day?
Michelle Walker seemed to indicate that we could get that all done in one day. She really felt that we could.
The recommendation is that the staffs would, my understanding of the process, the staffs would recommend the 2 top vendors for various pieces. And I think that the biggest time crunch on that is the need to review the RFI submissions between June 6th when we get them, and then be able to turn those around and turn them into recommendations for who presents, and then contact the vendors to then come present on the 12th. I think that the day of the 12th will be possible. Some of the rest of that, it'll be a crunch, but we'll get it. We will get it done.
Must be somebody important.
It is.
So, anything else we want to bring up today?
The only other thing that I would like to bring up, just as something that we should be thinking about, because I can't remember whether it was the beginning of this meeting or the end of the last meeting, because they're starting to blur together for me. But I heard a question about when some decisions have to be made, and I want to clarify that we are going to need some decisions before the RFP is finalized. Now, right now, the RFP on the timeline that you all have is projected to be drafted and disseminated by the end of June. It's up to you all whether we wind up pushing any of those timelines back, but just as we have the next meeting on the 4th and then have presentations on the 12th, we need to realize that those RFI presentations and the receipt of this information will hopefully inform us answering some questions, because the RFP will have to be relatively specific about things like alignment. If you want an assessment to serve as your GQE, you're going to need to put language into your RFP that designates that, because vendors will want to know what they're signing on for, what they're committing to and assuring alignment for. So I just wanted to flag that as we move forward, that we need to be thinking about answering some of the big policy questions about all of this by the end of next month. And if we want to have it done, then really by mid-month next month, because drafting the RFP is going to take quite a bit of time.
So we may need to have another meeting shortly after the 12th.
Yes.
That's what you're saying. Okay. You could have just said that.
I'm sorry. I didn't want to say.
You could have just done it.
We need to have another meeting, but we might need to have another meeting.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody.